Hey, sixth graders, we are back at history. We are still talking about the ancient Mesopotamians, and we're talking specifically about the Sumerian civilization. Now, for where we are in our book on page 27, and we're in our SAM on page 17. And you'll remember from the last video that this web style of note-taking kind of hops around a little bit. So I will be putting things on the board as best I can. And this video, you can really just double check the work that you've done on your own on page 17 and compare it to what I've got on the video. So we're going to be talking about society today. And we will get all the way through, I think, just society, because it's a little bit of a chunk. There won't be a whole lot on our workbook page, but there'll be a lot of information that you'll want to kind of file away and remember. It'll come in handy for the test and for some of the, for the study guide, of course, and then for some of the extra credit pages for sure. Okay, so early civilizations pretty early on developed social classes. So now you know we're talking about the box on page 17 that says social classes. Social classes, what social classes are different levels of a culture into which people are divided. In the US, our social classes are largely economic. We have very wealthy people and very poor people and different sort of economic classes in between. It doesn't necessarily mean that some people are better than other people. It just means they make more money. We also kind of divide into different kinds of jobs, right? But most societies divide, along some lines. And the ancient Sumerians were no different. The Sumerian civilization mainly had three classes. And the first class, the class kind of at the top, the upper class, consisted of the ruler, of the government officials, and the priests. Now, if you want to abbreviate the word government or governmental, this is how you do it, G-O-V, apostrophe T. So government officials, the ruler, and the priests. You'll see later on in the chapter how important priests were to the running of Sumerian culture. The middle class mainly consisted of farmers, fishermen, merchants, traders, and skilled workers. Sometimes when I say trader, it sounds like traitor. Trader, people who trade things back and forth, and skilled workers. Skilled workers were the people who knew how to make things, artisans. Now, slaves were the lowest class of people, and you're going to find this to be true in many of the ancient societies that we're going to study this year. Slaves were very common in Sumer. A lot of times here in America, when we think of slavery, we think of American slavery prior to our Civil War. Slavery in the ancient world was not quite like that. Now, I want to say before I even get started that slavery is not okay. We do not condone the owning of another human being in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But having said that, there are different kinds of slavery. And what happened in the Americas was a particularly brutal and horrible kind of slavery. What we're talking about in ancient Sumer is a little bit different. Slaves were people who were forced to serve others, and they were thought of as property. Slaves, some of them were prisoners of war. So if your city-state went to war with another city-state and you won, you would take back some of their people as slaves. Some people were slaves because they were criminals. Maybe they were caught stealing or something like that. And part of their punishment was they had to become a slave. Some people became slaves to pay off their debts. We have another term for that. In some places it's called an indentured servant. But these people became a slave in order to pay off a debt. Maybe they owed more money than they could pay off working at a real job. And so they said to the person they owed money, I'll be your slave for this amount of time. And I'll pay off my debt that way. Now, the thing is, and this is what made slavery different in ancient Sumer than in the American South. And that is that slaves had privileges. They could hold property. So a slave could own his own property. A slave could go into business. Sumerian slaves could eventually purchase their own freedom. In fact, in a lot of the cultures we're going to study, that was the case. So you're done with your work for your owner for the day. You still have time. You still have energy. You could go work somewhere else and make a little money to earn your freedom. That's one of the main differences between the slavery that we had here in the United States and the slavery that they had in ancient Mesopotamia. So we're on page 28. Now, we're going to be talking about a lot of different jobs. So on the box that says job specialization, where it says 3 specialized jobs were, you've got a lot of different answers you can put down there. And we're going to talk about some of them actually right now. So fishermen, merchants, and traders. The Sumerians were some of the first people to use sails on a sailboat to harness the wind. A lot of boats sailed up and down the Euphrates River, and if you're sailing down a river, right, or if you're on a boat going down a river, that's pretty easy. But how are you going to go back up the river? The Sumerians figured out that they could use a sail to do that. Some of the boats that were sailing on the Euphrates were traders, people that had come from far away to trade with the ancient Sumerians. Other boats were fishing boats. Fishing boats that were owned by local Sumerians. They would go out very early in the morning and they would catch fish, and then they would go back to the marketplace and sell the fish they caught. The Sumerian diet, fish was very important and bread was very important. Now, the ancient city of Ur was on the Euphrates River, and there were docks there where the trading ships and the fishing boats could dock and stay and be anchored. And so there was a lot of business that sprung up around there. Of course, you need dock workers, you need merchants to buy the things the traders are bringing and then sell them in their shops. Sailors, you need fishermen, you need all these people. What's really interesting is that these ships brought stuff from as far away as India. And if you were to look on a map, you would see that India is, quite a fair ways away. Now, it's not like they were bringing stuff from, North America, but back then, India was, many days' journey, many days, maybe even weeks away from the city of Ur. And so it was pretty impressive that they traded with people as far east as India and as far west as Egypt. Now, in the city of Ur, there were many workshops where people would create things, craft things. And the problem with that is that Sumer didn't have a lot of natural resources on its own. So they would bring these trading boats in loaded with things like gems, right, gemstones, wood, because the city of Ur didn't have a lot of trees. There wasn't a lot of wood around. And metal, different kinds of metal, gold, silver, copper, iron, those kinds of things. None of these things were natural resources in ancient Sumer, and so they had to bring it in. They had to trade it. Of course, at the beginning, trade was conducted by barter. Barter is a trading system where I give you one thing and you give me something else, right? So maybe you have 3 sheep and you trade me your 3 sheep for my 1 cow. That's barter. A merchant maybe would trade his grain for lumber or for copper or for whatever he needed. You might have a food surplus in one city-state. Maybe one city-state grew lots of barley and a different city-state didn't, and so a city-state that was on the river might trade fish for that barley. You see how this works? Trade between the city-states helped them grow in wealth and in power. Trading with other civilizations is absolutely essential. It's very, very, very important to the growth of any civilization. At the same time as ancient Sumer, there were people in other parts of the world that were organizing into civilizations, and they traded with the civilization of Sumer. One of the cool things about ancient Sumer is that they kept very meticulous records of their business dealings. People would have a business transaction, and there would be a person there recording that transaction. The person recording the transaction is known as a scribe. A scribe was the person who would write things down. So they would use a stylus, which was usually a reed or a stick, and they would write the sales down on a clay tablet that was not hard yet. It was soft still. Then the tablet would be allowed to dry, and once the tablet was dry, it would be put in another inside kind of an envelope also made out of clay, and then that would be allowed to dry. And they would store all of those in the temple with all of the legal records. I want you to look very quickly on page 37 in your book, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get there, but you can see on page 37 a photograph of a Sumerian legal document and the envelope, the clay envelope it came out of. It's really cool. When the two merchants would finish their business deal and the scribe would finish writing it, each man, because it was usually men, would have to sign it. Now, they didn't sign their names the way we sign ours. You know, if I were going to sign my name, Rachel Hansen, right, that's my signature. But they didn't sign it like that. Each person had what was called a cylinder seal. Now, cylinder seals were tiny. You can see a picture of one on page 29. And they were these round cylinders that were 1 to 2 inches long, so little bitty, little tiny thing. And they were carved very intricately with carvings that would identify the owner, the owner's name, their family name, plants, animals, gods, the wedge-shaped symbols called cuneiform, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And they would roll, each man would roll his seal across the wet clay, and that was basically the way they would sign their names. It either stood for approval, like on a document, or it stood for ownership, like on a crate of something ready to be shipped. Now, these goods, once they were unloaded at the docks, didn't stay at the docks for very long because workers would take them into the city. And that is where the artisans would take these craftsmen or take these things and turn them into these beautiful items. Artisans it's another word for skilled craftsmen. The stuff that these craftsmen, these artisans would make was actually most of what Sumer exported back out. So they would import the raw materials and then create these beautiful things and send them back out. A lot of the workshops there made stuff for everyday use. And there were many cloth shops. And the cloth makers would employ women to take wool or flax, and they would spin it on a spinning wheel into thread, and then they would weave the thread into cloth. So they had looms where you would have the threads or the yarn up, and then you would weave under and over and under and over and under and over and under and over another piece of thread to the side, and they would use different colors of thread to make different kinds of things. The people of Ur would buy their cloth at one shop. Usually the thread wasn't already dyed. Sometimes it was, depending on what kind of shop it was, but usually they would take then their cloth to a dye shop and have it dyed in different colors. Now, I know sometimes we see like pictures of Jesus and he's got a white robe and kind of a blue sash. Honestly, Jesus probably didn't wear anything like that. And the reason is because blue was a very expensive dye. So was red, so was purple. Because they were very difficult to get, and so only very wealthy people had brightly colored clothes. Most people just wore cloth made out of the color of the sheep or the color of the flax. Ur was also known for its pottery. Beautiful pottery has come out of this part of the world. Clay was one of the few raw materials they actually did have. And so they would make clay, and the pottery wheel was used in ancient Ur. And I don't know if you've ever seen a potter at a pottery wheel. And of course, our pottery wheels now are powered by electricity. They usually have a switch where the potter can hit the switch with their knee or with their foot, make it go faster or slower. But the wheel goes around and you put the clay on the wheel, and as it spins, you shape it into something. It basically worked the same back then too. It's just, they had to constantly be pressing their foot to turn the lever to make the wheel go. They would throw clay onto the wheel, and they would form all these different pots. Before the pottery wheel was invented, they made pots using just molding by hand or coiling. So you would make like a snake out of clay, and you would spiral it up to the bottom, and then you would spiral it up until it was the size you wanted it. The potters would add carvings, or they would add decorations to the pots so that they were pretty and not just useful. What's really interesting is that this hasn't changed. The basic way pottery is made is still the same now as it was back then. There just hasn't been a lot of change. Clay is still clay. Maybe the paints are a little bit different. The different kind of glazes we use are a little bit different. Maybe they're a little less likely to break. But making pottery for the most part is basically the same as it was back then. Pitchers, bowls, cups, plates, basically the same design. You could maybe, we have different, painting schemes on them, different kinds of colors, different kinds of different kinds of designs, but overall the shape of all those things is basically the same, which is kind of interesting to me over these thousands of years. You can still go to the Middle East and you can buy Middle Eastern pottery that's made in the same style, in the same way that it was back then. In fact, if you look at the picture on page 30, you can see a photograph of a potter from the country of Iran making pottery in the same way. Now, these were kind of everyday things, but the city of Ur also had very wealthy people, and so they had shops that carried luxury goods. And so you had jewelers, and you had goldsmiths and silversmiths, people that made things out of copper and just beautiful things. Jewelry, really beautifully done. On page 31, you can see some jewelry necklaces made out of carnelian, which is kind of the reddish bead that's on that necklace, and then lapis lazuli, which is the bluish, and then of course gold. One of the things that Ur was known for was shell inlay, which is really beautiful. What they would do is they would get white shells from the river and arrange them into a design, and then press the pieces into some softened tar on another surface, like metal. And then they would surround it with other things like lapis lazuli. And if you are an inlay artist, you had to be very, 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 very careful, because shells are very easily broken. One of the things I want you to look at, and this is where we're going to end for today, on page 32, is the standard of Ur. Now, if you look at this, honestly, it looks like a painting. But this is a wooden box that was made out of shell inlay. Shell inlay with red limestone and lapis lazuli, and they used it to create these different scenes. You can actually see the panel on the top is titled War, and the panel on the bottom is titled Peace. And it's amazingly detailed, really beautiful, and it's something that I think, you know, any artist today would be proud to make and produce because of the amazing amount of time and amazing amount of detail they went into it. One of the things that I think is really cool about the way God has created us is God is a creator. Obviously, he created the world, but he created us to be creators as well. And even these people who did not know God still had something in their souls that told them to create and to make things that were beautiful. And people have been creating art from the very beginning of time. A little bit later, we'll learn that music is the same way, that every civilization has its forms of art and forms of beauty that it creates to kind of fulfill something inside of us. And I think that is one of my favorite, I guess you could say, proofs of God, that we are creative beings. We don't just make things useful, we make things beautiful as well. And the people of Ur, the people of ancient Sumer, were no different. Now, next time I make a video, we're going to talk about priests and religion and kings and government, and we'll see how far we can get through. I hope you have a great night, and we'll see you later.